Welcome back to talkSPORT USA with myself, Will Varney. Good to have your company as ever. The NFL draft just 3 weeks away, which means we're going to continue our team previews building up to the big day in Pittsburgh, or should I say few days over that weekend from the 23rd of April. Look, I mentioned the team previews. Today we're going to be focusing on the team with the 18th overall pick in the first round, the Minnesota Vikings, an intriguing team who had a disappointing season last year, but still so much talent on this roster and coaching staff. So let's see how important the 2026 NFL draft is going to be to the Vikings. Pleasure to say, to help me do just that, it's our good friend, Vikings reporter for the Purple Insider. It's Mr. Matthew Coller. Matthew, how are you?
I'm doing okay. If you have any ideas of where the Vikings are going to go with the 18th overall pick, let me know, because this is probably the first year I can remember in a long time where you can make an argument for 5 or 6 different positions on the field, especially with the way the Vikings handled free agency, which was not doing a whole lot outside of bringing in Kyler Murray. And then you start to look 1 year down the road and go, they've got a little bit of an older roster here, and they've got a lot of guys who are either going to be very expensive, that might be cap casualties, or are going to be free agents. And you can make a case for a lot of different directions, for trading down, for trading up to try to get a blue chip type of player. This one feels very wide open for the Minnesota Vikings.
Well, we're going to get stuck into it, don't you worry, because a lot of people have been mocking one player in particular to the Vikings in the mock draft. So we're going to get stuck into that, don't worry. I did want to start. The last time that we spoke, it was just off the back, or I think it was about two games remaining in the regular season. It was clear the Vikings weren't going to make the playoffs, and it was all really the fallout of what we'd seen from J.J. McCarthy in his first year as a starter. And you used the term rubbernecking at that time, where it was all of these people who were looking at what the Vikings were doing, maybe sort of having a wry smile and maybe a surprise over what had happened. But heading into this offseason now, we've got this fascinating situation that's played out with Kyler Murray coming into the building, and really what that's done and how this quarterback room has shaped up. They bring Carson Wentz back in free agency, and J.J. McCarthy's still there. You mentioned just before we started recording, you've been at the NFL owners meeting this week, speaking with the hierarchy and with Kevin O'Connell. I just wanted to begin by getting a sense of where did they allude to how this quarterback room was shaping up, and whether Kyler Murray would indeed be the starter once the regular season gets underway?
Yeah, when it comes to what Kevin O'Connell is going to say publicly, and I started to almost think about how many press conferences he's going to be asked, hey, is Kyler Murray QB1 throughout the next couple months with OTAs and mini camps, and then when we finally get to training camp. But there is no question who QB1 is for the Minnesota Vikings, and that is Kyler Murray. If you wanted to go out and get a player to compete with J.J. McCarthy for a starting job, you don't get somebody this good. And I know that Kyler Murray recently has not had as much success as he had early in his career. He is not 30 years old yet, not even really that close to 30 years old. He's been a Pro Bowler multiple times. He has had stretches throughout his career where he has played like a top 5 quarterback. He has not had a full season where he's done that. But when you look at what NFL executives think of him and where they've ranked him, like Mike Sando of The Athletic does an article every year where he talks to executives and coaches and has them rank the quarterbacks tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he has consistently been a top 15 quarterback and is ranked as high as 12th. And if you look at PFF grades year by year, his highest ranking was inside the top 10. And as recently as 2024, he was 12th. This is somebody who was a number 1 overall pick, a Heisman, is one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the league. If you look at Pro Football References on target percentage and bad throw percentages, he has been elite. He is one of the best playmaking quarterbacks. I mean, if you look from 2020 to 2024, I believe Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts are the only quarterbacks, and Josh Allen, that have a higher total EPA rushing than Kyler Murray. So you are talking about someone who at times throughout his career has shown a very, very high ceiling and star potential, but has never really had an organization or a coaching staff or a supporting cast, mainly Justin Jefferson, to the level that he could be given in Minnesota. DeAndre Hopkins was the closest thing, and those were the years where he played his best football. When you compare that to where J.J. McCarthy is at, This was someone who was just not prepared to be a starting quarterback in the NFL last year. The team made a bad bet by moving on from Sam Darnold and hoping that he would be ready. But I'm sure you've heard the Mike Tyson, you don't know, you can have a plan until you get punched in the face. I kind of look at it as the NFL, an NFL season is like climbing a mountain, and you can go to a tall building and try to climb upstairs and simulate what it's like to go to the top of Kilimanjaro. But until you're actually halfway up that mountain, you don't know what it's really like. And no one can ever predict what it's going to be like. And I think the Vikings didn't know that he was going to be so volatile. It was going to be so up and down, not only just with his performances, but also emotionally for him. It seemed like the intensity of the NFL was a lot to handle for a young player. And this is a team that is not in a position to let that play out and just see like, hey, maybe he'll figure it out, and maybe he'll get more accurate, and maybe he'll get better command of the offense, and maybe he'll be able to deal with the emotional ups and downs and all that sort of stuff. That is a lot to ask for a team that has so many veteran players. They kept TJ Hawkinson. They brought back Aaron Jones, just a clear signal of, we are not tearing this thing down after firing the general manager. We still believe in this roster and think that it could win the NFC North with the proper level of quarterback play. And I also think when you put under a microscope Kyler Murray and Sam Darnold, there's a lot of similarities. It's two guys who had a lot of things said about them in the past that were with very bad organizations. Murray clearly has played better than Darnold before he got here, but the raw talent is absolutely there to take a team to the playoffs and be dangerous. When you compare that to somebody who performed last year, like one of the bottom 5 quarterbacks in the entire NFL, there's just no argument. There's no debate. And I felt at the owners' meetings that you could sense how excited Kevin O'Connell was to have Kyler Murray. It doesn't benefit him at all to say Kyler is QB1 because, I don't know, what if he gets hurt? You want to keep JJ pushing and improving. And look, if he gets hurt after 5 games like he did last year, then JJ McCarthy's got to be your quarterback again. So you can't manipulate him by, declaring it right now. But I think it's going to be very, very clear as the summer plays out, as they get into reps at training camp, that it's Kyler Murray's show.
Look, you mentioned at the top that this was a free agency that was quite quiet for the Vikings, apart from maybe the Kyler Murray signing. James Pierre comes in from the Steelers. Vandermark comes in as a potential swing tackle. They re-sign Eric Wilson. Carson Wentz comes back as well. But we often talk about how free agency shapes a team's and franchise thinking ahead of the draft. It was quiet. What did you make overall of the business that's been done in so far in free agency? And did it slightly disappoint you in a way or surprise you in a way that they weren't more active or aggressive?
Well, as a podcaster who, enjoys downloads and views and things like that, I would say there was a lack of emergency podcasts that, in previous years we've had a lot of fun with. But at the same time, in previous years, sometimes those big signings like Andrew Van Ginkel and Jonathan Grenard and Blake Cashman have worked out amazingly, and Aaron Jones has worked out as well. But if you look at last year, all the money spent, I don't think that it was spent in the best possible way. And when you really look at free agency year after year, there are teams you can find that absolutely built big parts of their team through free agency and hit a lot of home runs. But this year, where was the money spent most? The Las Vegas Raiders, the New York Jets, the Tennessee Titans, those franchises that have been at the bottom of the entire NFL and that are drafting really high this year, they're trying to get to any sort of relevancy. So they're throwing huge dollar figures at players who honestly are not worth the money that they're getting. And we've also reached a point where the NFL salary cap is going up so much year after year, maybe thanks to international games and international sales and interest. That's part of it. I think Amazon probably helps a little bit, and Netflix with that. But there are so big of gains in terms of the revenue they're bringing in and then raising the salary cap that teams are saying, we can kick money down the road, or we can just bet on the salary cap going up so we can give out contracts to our current players that are on our roster, which means that the caliber of free agent goes down from previous seasons. So if you want to spend huge, crazy money just because you've got nothing on your roster like the Tennessee Titans, you can. But if you're the Minnesota Vikings, is that really the best way to approach your roster build? Or is it to give more opportunities to some players you've developed, and then wait until, I guess this would be like the third, or maybe you could even call it the fourth wave of free agency, when guys slip through the cracks and you get much better contracts and much shorter term contracts that won't hurt you down the road. And it's been clear from their interim general manager, Rob Brzezinski, that the long term vision is a part of this, that they do not want to sell themselves down the river for just a chance at 2026 to panic and try to fill one need by giving out a really bad contract. It feels like that's what they did last year in a bunch of different places, and they don't want to repeat that mistake. So I think the best way to describe it, I've sort of joked, people talk about like ethical basketball. I don't know if you heard like Wembanyama said, call it ethical basketball. It's like ethical cap and roster building management from the Minnesota Vikings this offseason. And I think it's smart because the franchise does not end after the year 2026, but there are some spots on the roster that I'm looking at and going, not really fully sure what you're doing there. And we may find this out later in the summer, or we may find this out on draft night.
It makes the draft even more fascinating. And you mentioned there about the front office situation, which I think is really interesting. The fact that there is still no permanent appointment to replace Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. Rob Brzezinski has come in to lead the front office operations, but on an interim basis. So as far as I'm aware, there's still no guarantee that he's going to take that job or be offered that job on a permanent basis once the draft is done. So if the draft doesn't go well or there's not any hits, it's almost like, well, who's to blame here? A new GM comes into building and probably has a clean slate. Look, we often talk about the draft, and there's this age-old question of whether you look at impact versus really positional value. And I suppose maybe that leads me on to this first-round pick that the Vikings have at 18th overall. So many people, like I mentioned in the introduction, have mocked Dylan Tieneman, the safety out of Oregon, in this spot, 18th overall. I just wonder, from your perspective, do you like that fit, or do you feel like taking a safety at 18th overall is a bit of a reach when you assess this is a deep wide receiver class, a deep edge class, for example? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it with the debate there, because I think with Thieneman, you couldn't ask for a player built in a lab any better to play for Brian Flores. He has been a versatile guy in his career in college. He's been a playmaker in college. He's known as being highly intelligent, high effort, all those things, but also when he goes to the NFL Combine, freakishly athletic. And when you run a sub 4.4 and put up the numbers that he did, and you go, okay, well, that is somebody that has the potential to be special. And I think that that's where they have to decide, because if you're the team that drafted Derwin James or Kyle Hamilton in the first round, guess how many regrets you have? Zero, because those are total game-changing players. You think the Minnesota Vikings are sad that once upon a time they picked Harrison Smith as a first rounder? Probably not, as he has made a Hall of Fame case for his career. The problem is that if the guy doesn't become that player and he's just a good player, then you can find those all over the place in free agency. And just for example, I mean, Jaquan Brisker, the Vikings have played against him a bunch in Chicago. I think he's a pretty good safety. He went for like $6 million. And Jalen Hawkins was another guy who was in New England and was in the Super Bowl and played really well for New England. And it was around the ballpark of the same thing. Even the Vikings had a very, very good safety hit free agency last year, Cam Bynum. He goes for $15 million. Like, that's a reasonable price for someone who's going to play 1,100 snaps for you, get a handful of interceptions, line up in different spots, high intelligence, all this sort of stuff. So if you only become Cam Bynum, which is a median outcome for somebody like that, then you have kind of wasted a draft pick. If he becomes Kyle Hamilton, then you feel like you're an absolute genius. I think that that logic doesn't exactly apply to some other positions. And you mentioned wide receiver. I don't think that they're going to look at wide receiver in the first round. I think that's more of a second, third type of situation. But if you get a good number 2 wide receiver, or even a number 3, that's worth so much money. We just saw Jalen Naylor get paid $12 million from the Las Vegas Raiders in free agency. I mean, that's almost as much as we're talking about to get a really good safety in free agency for a guy who's never got to 30 catches in a year. Like the receiver position is impossible to find. The teams that have them, they never let them go. They franchise tag them. They sign them. They will only get rid of them if the guy is so disgruntled or too expensive or too old or whatever. But you can't go into free agency and find good receivers or edge rushers. And I think it's becoming true for defensive tackles and elite corners. You can never find elite corners in free agency. You could find a lot of okay corners, but not game changers there. So I think that that's really what it comes down to. And maybe that's me overthinking it a little bit. Maybe he's just the best player and that's how they're going to approach it. But I think when you have to look at a long-term team build with a lot of players, Harrison Smith is either going to retire this year or very, very soon. So that's somebody you're not going to have. And Blake Cashman at linebacker is a free agent, and Van Ginkel is a free agent after this year. And there's trade talks with Jonathan Grenard. You have to think about if you were doing this with no knowledge of what the roster is going to be, because even projecting it a year down the road is pretty difficult.
You mentioned there just a couple of other positions like wide receiver and edge that potentially there needs to be a focus on. The Vikings have 9 picks in this draft. I think 3 are in the top 100. So there's a real good opportunity for Minnesota this year to find some great talent to have an impact on that roster. What are some of maybe those other positions then alongside wide receiver, edge, maybe center with Ryan Kelly potentially now gone out the building? What are some of those other spots that you think they need to focus on in terms of filling holes on the roster?
Yeah, when you say that, I mean, I could think of a bunch of them that would make a lot of sense. I mean, yeah, wide receiver 3 is open now, though after they are going to pick up the 5th-year option for Jordan Addison, now that we know they want to stick with him for at least another year, they could probably wait another year to spend a high pick on a wide receiver. Center is up there, but I don't see any prospects that would be worth a first, maybe even a second-round draft pick for a center, and those guys are hard to start right away because the NFL is very complicated, so it seems that Blake Brandel is probably going to start for them, but they could look in day 2, late day 2. They have 2 third-round draft picks for the center position. I'm very curious about running back, where they bring back Aaron Jones, but that's a 1-year Band-Aid. And last year, Jordan Mason was really good, but what they don't have in that backfield is any sort of lightning, any sort of explosiveness, guys with big playability, which has been severely lacking for this team in its run game, basically since Kevin O'Connell got here. And we have, rarely seen anyone who strikes fear into a defense in the backfield, but this is not considered a very good running back draft class past Jeremiah Love, who is expected to go in the top 10. I mean, there are scenarios where I guess you could potentially trade up for him, but I think he's going to be gone by the 6th or 7th draft pick. Edge rusher is more of a long-term play, but if there's a guy in the first round, you should take him there. If you look at 2nd round, 3rd round edge rushers in the past, it is a low rate of success because it's such a valuable position if they get past the 1st round, and it's so much of a physical position. It's size, it's speed, that sort of thing. And if you're in the 3rd, 4th round, you might be a project with some of those things. But I think the best ones usually have to be taken in the 1st. Defensive tackle is absolutely up there. I'm basically just going through the whole roster here, but this is what I mean. This is like where we started.
Yeah.
They lost their 2 starting defensive tackles, Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave, and they're very happy with Jalen Redmond. But behind that's not a lot of experience. It's a 5th round draft pick. It's a 7th round draft pick. It's an undrafted guy. And that's really the whole depth chart right now. But then I look at the defensive tackle group in the draft and I see a lot of run stuffers, which I would not want to take in the 1st round. I still think even as rushing becomes a little more valuable, that if you're drafting a run stuffing nose tackle in the 1st round, you're getting something that, again, you could get in free agency for a fair price. Linebacker is another one where the long term is pretty wide open. And I think maybe the best value meets need is at the cornerback position, because after this year, Isaiah Rodgers is a free agent and Byron Murphy Jr.'s contract sets up for him to potentially be a cap cut for next year. So drafting a corner to have as depth right away and maybe a rotational type player, then be a long-term starter on the outside, that's where those things meet up to me. And I still view corner as also one of the premium positions that are hard to replace the top guys and also, play a huge role in your success as a defense.
I think that makes it so interesting, isn't it? Because it goes back to that question, like I asked, where you have that instant impact, or whether you look for that value that down the line, like for you, say, for example, he's going to be depth this year, but next year he's going to be your starter. You mentioned Andrew Van Ginkel, Blake Cashman, potentially free agents heading into next year. So all of this sort of planning that goes into it and preparation. Maybe I'm putting you slightly on the spot here, but we obviously mentioned how Dylan Tienemann is right now. Everybody's saying he's going to be the 18th overall pick for the Vikings. Are there any other names that have maybe stood out to you that you think haven't been maybe mentioned in that spot that you like the idea or the thought of? I know that, for example, Kenyon Sadiq is planned to have a meeting with the Vikings. Are there any other those names shouting out to you?
Yeah, I mean, Kenyon Sadiq is one that I've mentioned on my show as a good idea because TJ Hawkinson is a free agent after this year. And if you don't have a wide receiver 3 and you don't have a great way to get one, well, a tight end 2 can be pretty good. And somebody like Sadiq is really a pass catcher and kind of looks like Derrick Henry at the tight end position when you actually match up their size, speed, and the numbers at the NFL Combine. You'd feel pretty good about throwing a check down to a guy who could break 5 tackles and, get an extra 10 yards. So I like that option. But some of the more recent thought about him coming out of the combine was that he's going to go a little earlier than where the Vikings are. Tight ends have been a little all over the place in years past. Some teams have been willing to invest high picks on them, like Kyle Pitts or Colston Loveland or Brock Bowers. So I would expect that that's a bit in vogue since it's been successful recently, and somebody might reach out to pick him. The guy who's been on my radar quite a bit is Jermod McCoy because he tore his ACL and did not play in 2025, had an incredible 2024 season, and then did not participate at the combine, which made people raise eyebrows. Like, well, okay, that's going to hurt his draft stock. Then he decides to have his pro day, absolutely lights it on fire, runs a 4.4. This is a guy who has all the physical traits to be a number 1 corner. And when you look at the entire draft, McCoy and Mansour Delane are probably the only guys who could be a number 1 corner and would be worth that first round draft pick. So I'm throwing him out there. And I guess the deep kind of off the grid, people aren't talking about position that is on my mind a little bit is offensive tackle because of the strength of the draft. There seems to be a lot of offensive tackle talent in the first round. Those guys take a long time to develop. And the Vikings have Brian O'Neill, who's in his 30s and is not under contract after this year, and Christian Darrisaw, who is an incredible player at left tackle, but suffered an injury last year that was problematic for him for the entire season. I mean, he was having games where he would start and play 3 quarters and then he would take himself out of the game seemingly. And his recovery was never quite right from his ACL tear. So we don't know where that's going to stand by the end of this season. If they have internal concerns, then they might think about drafting a tackle, and you could always use that as depth. And I like to go back to, there's a person, and I forget their name on Twitter, so I apologize for them. They put out every year this list of how often starting offensive lines played together in a given season. And there's only like 5 teams, even over 50%. Like, those injuries happen so often. So if they drafted a tackle, fans would be like, what the heck are they doing? They don't need a tackle. They have 2 offensive tackles. But both Darrisaw and O'Neill missed time last year, and there was a ton of shuffling that went on. And usually with elite tackles in terms of talent, if a guard got hurt, you could put that guy into the guard position and have him hold his own and learn how to play. And then long term, we know how valuable tackle is. Those guys are costing $30 million a year. That is my dark horse for the Vikings. I think that everybody who's mocking Dylan Thieneman to them, it makes a lot of sense. I see why everyone's doing it. It fits. But I also think that there's room for mock creativity with some different positions here for the Vikings.
Final couple of quick ones from me, Matt. I just wanted to ask you about this situation that's on playing with Jonathan Grenard right now. He played only 12 games last season. He was banged up for a lot of it, but he's a player that we know when he's healthy, when he's fit, when he's firing on all cylinders, he creates a formidable pass rush alongside Van Ginkel and then this emerging talent in Dallas Turner. So just from your perspective, I think KOC said this week he feels like this is something that's going to get done. They want to keep him on the roster, but there does come a point where if there's trade potential, what do you see happening here? Is he somebody you just can't afford to let leave the building?
I think what they're waiting to find out is if somebody gets really desperate, because now the dust has pretty much settled with pass rushers. And when you look at the draft, there's just not that many great talents. There's some good players and there's some interesting players in the draft, but there's not your Myles Garrett. There's not your Nick Bosa. And there are also a number of teams, as always, that are under an immense amount of pressure. I think the Philadelphia Eagles feel like they're teetering a little bit, and the Indianapolis Colts. These are two teams that have been connected to the Vikings, but I've been told that some teams that made offers to them were talking like day 3 draft picks for Jonathan Grenard, which I know to people sounds like, wait a minute, like he's such a good player. You mentioned how valuable he is. He's a leader and all that sort of stuff. But just like at a yard sale, sometimes we overvalue our own stuff. If you're on the other side, do you guys call it a yard sale? Do you have like an English word for that? Is
it car boot. Car boot is the English term.
Okay. All right. Well,
yeah.
One of those. So if you, you know what I mean, though. I mean, when you're selling,
I know what you mean.
eBay would be another example where people put up prices and nobody on the outside is willing to pay that if you're getting rid of it. Jonathan Grenard did not have great sack production last year. He is coming off of an injury and he wants a new contract. And if I'm another team, I'm saying, why should I give you a second-round draft pick and I have to pay this player more money and he's coming off an injury and he didn't sack anybody last year? That's a tough sell. So I've been told that day 3 picks have been thrown out there a lot to the Vikings. They haven't been willing to do that. It might be just better to hang on to your favorite sweater than selling it at your yard sale. But when it comes to Jonathan Grenard, I think that once you sign Kyler Murray, you might as well keep Jonathan Grenard because you're trying to win. And you've kept Aaron Jones and you've kept TJ Hawkinson. If this was some sort of big full-on rebuild, I would say, man, you got to trade him for anything you can get. It's not. They haven't shown any sign of rebuilding. They haven't traded away any other players. The only guys that they let go were underachievers last year who were going to be overpaid, and we always figured were kind of one-year contracts anyway. Those were the only guys they let go, and then they've kept everything else intact. Their signal to the world has been, now that we have Kyler Murray, we think we're a real serious contender in the NFC. If you trade Jonathan Grenard, then it looks like, okay, right? But who else is, okay, Dallas Turner and Andrew Van Ginkel, you feel good about that. But who else? Like, this is a position that rotates in a lot. It's a position where if a guy gets hurt, then you're talking about an undrafted free agent at the moment on this roster having to step in. If they were to have plans to draft a first-round edge rusher, then that might change the formula, though. And so everything feels fluid with this roster that we might see them, make a decision if somebody comes in with a day 2 pick. Hey, we'll give you, a third and a fourth from next year or something. They might say, because there are a lot of long-term benefits to trading Grenard. Draft capital that they so desperately need. Cap space, somebody else is taking on that, so you don't have to give him a new contract potentially going into next year with his guarantees run out, and age in general. You're trying to get younger as a team, and he's pushing 30, so there are benefits to it, but I just don't see the benefits right now.
You taught me the term rubbernecking last time out. I've taught you car boot. So look,
car boot. Okay.
Car boot. Yeah, exactly. Okay. It's basically everyone drives into a field in their cars and all of their stuff that they're going to sell is in the car, in the boot of their car. And then that's where you sort of, that's the equivalent of a yard sale here in the UK. So you can take that one with you.
The boot is the trunk?
Trunk, yes.
Okay.
There we go. We got there into that. There you go. That is the UK and the American language just meshing together there here on talkSPORT USA. Final question from me, Matt. As ever, really, really appreciate your time. Look, every draft is incredibly important to every team for different reasons, right? And it's been an ongoing thing in terms of it's going to change the future of a franchise, or it might just simply shape a season, like I've been saying. But for the Minnesota Vikings, how much is at stake in this 2026 draft? And if you were on the clock, what would you do with that 18th overall pick in the first round?
Yeah, the hardest part about talking about a lot being at stake with a draft is that, number one, there was a chart. I love my charts that showed the draft capital. If you added it up using like a value kind of chart, like those Jimmy Johnson charts that show a value for each time kind of draft pick.
Yeah.
So if you added up everyone's pick, like who ranks number one, and the Vikings were 16th. So put it this way, they have the 16th most draft value going into the draft. Is that rebuilding an entire franchise? Like, probably not. I mean, this isn't a situation where they have stockpiled for years to be able to own this draft and have it completely change the future of their franchise. So how do they move up that list? Trading down is probably the answer. I think trading down makes the most sense, but in a draft that doesn't have a lot of blue chip players that teams would be trying to leap up and get, I'm not sure what your options are going to be. I would probably go with that cornerback because I think that Brian Flores has done a great job of taping together that position and using his really talented safeties. But if Harrison Smith is gone, then the talent of the safety position is not going to be the same. And you have to have just better cover men. You have to be able to play man coverage at times. They have been the most zone heavy team in the NFL. And I don't think that that's because they want to be. I think that's because they have to be. They have not had the players to be able to do it. If I told you take the best player available, you might roll your eyes because, well, yeah, sure. I mean, everybody says it, but nobody actually does it. But I think that is reasonable in this case, that if the best if Jermod McCoy is off the board and it's not a corner, well, then you can pivot to, a Kenyon Sadiq. And if he's off the board, you can pivot to a Spencer Fano, who's an offensive tackle, and you can make a darn good argument for all of these. I think there are some potential pitfalls to it, like drafting, a nose tackle just because some teams had some success running against you last year. Like, don't chase your losses from last year, but it's kind of hard to lose it for them, or it's hard to come out of it with people not saying that their pick made a lot of sense, at least for now and later. But how important it is, I mean, we always like to treat, because it's such a huge event, we like to treat it like, well, they just drafted this guy and that's going to change everything. But do you know how often the lines move in Vegas after the draft from before the draft? Almost never, because they know, and they've done the research on this, that there are very few players that in year one will alter an entire franchise. It happens every once in a while. A fella named Justin Jefferson did it once for the Minnesota Vikings. But when it comes to rookies and their immediate impact, counting on that, it's hard to do. I think it's a lot more about the future of the franchise, that they need foundational pieces. There are only a couple guys that you could point to and say, this guy will absolutely be here for the next 2 years. I would say there's less than 5 of those guys on the entire roster. They need more than 5 of those guys on the entire roster. So too often we make it into, all right, we have this open position and you need to fill it right away. They did this in 2019 where it was like they needed a tight end and they needed a center and they were drafting them no matter what. And they missed out. The very next picks in 2019 after the Vikings were Jeffrey Simmons and AJ Brown. So they could have taken, and I know we could do this with a lot, but the very next picks were Jeffrey Simmons and AJ Brown, 2 megastars, and they didn't take them because they needed a center. So don't chase a need just because you have something to fill. Look for foundational pieces for the future, and what's done is done. I don't know that there's any move that they can make right now or even into June, after June 1st, or in training camp. There's no move that you can make that's changing what's been built over the last couple years. And this is kind of the end of the run of the roster that's been put together over the last few seasons. So you are what you are. Now just try to add talent.
Well, I look forward to seeing how it all plays out in Pittsburgh in just 3 weeks' time. Matthew Coller from the Purple Insider, thank you so much for joining me here on talkSPORT USA.
Hey, thanks for having me, Will.